And good morning or good afternoon to everyone. It's nice to have you here. I hope you're prepared for a fantastic, really awesome roundtable we have here. We're really lucky to have all these award-winning authors and scholars, and really, I hope you're all set with questions and energy because this is going to be a fantastic synergy. You've had weeks building up to this, all those sessions, all those videos and readings, and so we're ready to go. So I'll do my introduction. I'll introduce everybody, and then I'm going to hand things over to Susanne, who will then be the moderator. And as per normal, as you know, we'll have the Q&A at the end. And so you can write us the questions in the chat, or of course, raise your hand emoji and we will unmute you and you can ask the question, okay? So let me start from the beginning. Our moderator today is Susanne Abou Ghaida, who has a PhD in education from the University of Glasgow. And her doctoral research was on the contemporary post-2000 Arabic adolescent novel and construction of adolescence. She's currently an associate tutor at the University of Glasgow and has in the past worked on programs with organizations in Egypt, Lebanon, and the UAE, active in the field of Arabic children's literature and reading promotion. She has written and co-written articles on disability, oral history, the potential of Arabic picture books as multicultural and multimodal texts, and the use of picture books to promote critical hope. I hope you all had a chance to watch her awesome video, really fantastic. I think all of us today should approach this roundtable using the youth lens approach that she offered to us, both in considering our authors roundtable as well in your general book choices as teachers in the classroom. Our next person on the roundtable is Naomi Shihab, who was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and her father was a Palestinian refugee and her mother an American of German and Swiss descent. Nye spent her adolescence in both Jerusalem and San Antonio, Texas. She earned her BA from Trinity University in San Antonio. Nye is the recipient of numerous honors and awards for her work, including the Ivan Sandroff Award for Lifetime Achievement from the National Book Critics Circle, the Lavon Award, the Patterson Poetry Prize, the Carity Randall Prize, the Isabella Gardner Poetry Award, the Lee Bennett Hopkins Poetry Award, the Robert Creeley Prize, and many pushcart prizes. She has received fellowships from the Lannan Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, and she was a Witter Bynner Fellow. From 2010 to 2015, she served as Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. In 2018, she was awarded the Lon Tinkle Award for Lifetime Achievement from the Texas Institute of Letters. Nye is the Poetry Foundation's Young People's Poet Laureate. We're very happy and honored to have her today. We also have Özge Samanci, who is a media artist and graphic novelist and associate professor in Northwestern University School of Communication. Her interactive installations have been exhibited internationally, including Siggraph Art Gallery, File Festival, Currents New Media, the Tech Museum of Innovation, WRO Media Art Biennial, Athens International Festival, Digital Arts and New Media, Piksel Electronic Arts Festival, ISEA, among others. Her autobiographical graphic novel, Dare to Disappoint, Farrar Straus Giroux 2015, received international press attention and was positively reviewed in the New York Times, The Guardian, Slate, along with many other media outlets. Dare to Disappoint has been translated into 5 languages, and her drawings appeared in The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, Slate Magazine, The Huffington Post, Airmail, Guernica, The Rumpus. In 2017, she received the Berlin Prize, and she was the Holtzbrinck Visual Arts Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. As I had mentioned to all of you, she also has a good collection of academic articles that you should view. And so we welcome her. Our next panelist is Monica Brown, who is the award-winning author of many magical multicultural books for children, including Charuco, El Arqueólogo Peruano, Peruvian archaeologist, Julio Seitelo, Frida and Her Animalitos, Waiting for the Biblioburro, Esperando al Biblioburro, Marisol McDonald Doesn't Match, No Combina, and the Lola Levine chapter book series. Her books have garnered multiple starred reviews, 2 America Awards, and a Christopher Award. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and NPR's All Things Considered, among others. Her latest book is Small Room, Big Dreams, the journal of Julian and Joaquin Castro, Spanish and English editions. Her new picture book, which is set to come out soon, is The Turquoise Room, El Cuarto Turquesa, is forthcoming from Lee and Low in 2022. She's a professor of English at Northern Arizona University, so another person, author, scholar, wearing multiple hats. And of the final person, last but not least on our panel, and a man who also wears many hats, is Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez, who's a graphic novelist, most notably recognized as the writer and creator of the critically acclaimed and best-selling superhero series La Borinqueña. In addition, he is the recipient of the San Diego Comic-Con 2019 Bob Clampett Humanitarian Award for his philanthropic efforts via the benefit anthology Reconstruction, Reminiscing and Rebuilding Puerto Rico, featuring La Borinqueña teaming up with Wonder Woman, Superman, Batman, and other DC comic heroes. As the creative director and owner of Somos Arte, a Brooklyn-based creative services studio, he has worked with such notable clients as Atlantic Records, Columbia University, Sony Pictures, and Marvel. We're hoping to add NYU to that list, as I mentioned to him earlier. In addition, Edgardo is a curator of art exhibitions, having already produced 3 original Marvel comic book art exhibitions and his very own La Borinqueña for the Smithsonian Museum. He has also written for Marvel Comics' critically acclaimed anthology, Guardians of the Galaxy, Tales of the Cosmos. I think we've all heard of them. Let's welcome Edgardo, Susanne, Naomi, Özge, and Monica. Thank you very much. And let me hand over the mic to Susanne.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Peter, and for thinking of me for the Summer Institute. I've had so much fun doing it. I'm going to have a very, very short introduction so that we can get to the roundtable part. So what I'm going to do is to provide a bit of a bridge between some of the things we've discussed earlier in the Summer Institute and this roundtable, and which is how we often talk about children or young people or adolescents as this one monolithic group. And we need to unpack that and realize that what it means to be young can mean very different things, whether it's based on individual circumstances or the social group you belong to. And this applies to people out there in the world, it applies to the students in your classrooms, and increasingly, thanks to the efforts of the authors on this roundtable, it's applying more to the characters that we're seeing in children's books, comic books, which I realize, has more of a crossover appeal. So my first question is, I want each of you to introduce one of your characters. Now, all of you write books that have characters, American people of color, some of them born here, some of them immigrated, as well as characters who might be living in other countries. So I want you to introduce one of your characters. It could be your favorite one, if you're able to choose one. It could be a character that you wished people knew more about, or it could be a character that you're still developing. So I think we will do this maybe alphabetically. So can we start with Edgardo?
Oh, cool. My character is Marisol Rios de la Luz. She's right there, right behind me. Um, Afro-Puerto Rican college student who goes abroad to study in Puerto Rico at the University of Puerto Rico during the economic crisis that we're still all living through right now. I decided to write around a character of African descent. Oftentimes, when you look at the Latinx story here in the United States and even in Latino America and the Caribe, it tends to be told through a Eurocentric standard of beauty, and there's a very prejudicial overlooking of darker complexion Latinx, an indigenous origin of African origin. Even though we are a racially mixed group. A Latinx identity is much more of an ethnic identity than it is of a racial identity, and there's so many sub-racial identities within each nation. So Marisol is a reflection of that. She's also a college student, and I chose to write a story through the lens of a college student because it's the first time for many of us who have the opportunity to study abroad to finally develop our own opinions, our own outlook on life. You know, for the most part, we're shaped by the family that we're raised in, and we're on our own when we're in school. So as an undergraduate student, I wanted to also place her in Puerto Rico. Over the last 5 years, there has been a lot that has been happening in Puerto Rico. As many of you may or may not know, Puerto Rico continues to be the oldest colony on the planet, 123 years now. There's been a lot of unstable political, economic, and environmental issues affecting the island. Literally right now, there's actually a group of college students and many other young people and activists protesting in the southern coast of Puerto Rico in the town of Rincon because of a multi-layered social issue. Climate change has caused the coastlines of Puerto Rico to be pretty much erased. The coastlines are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So private developments are losing their premium real estate properties, but the government of Puerto Rico is allowing them access to develop more properties on public beaches, and all the beaches in Puerto Rico are supposed to be public properties. So I created this character to address environmental issues, to address the economic issues, but mostly to engage people in a discourse around the decolonization of Puerto Rico. And Marisol herself, as a college student, is becoming more open to all of this and in developing her own ideology and her own opinions. But so is the reader, because the stories are written from a perspective that you don't need to have 123 years of colonial history of Puerto Rico to understand the storyline. You need to actually just literally turn the pages, and you start unraveling what's happening in this universe. Even though the character is fictional, it's very rooted in a reality that is affecting many Puerto Ricanos literally this very second. And that's Marisol Rios de la Luz.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Marisol. So we'll move over now to Monica.
Hi, I'm not going to talk about Marisol, but I have a Marisol series that are for picture books. So here's to the Marisols in the world that I'd be happy to talk about, because it was one of the most challenging book I ever had to get published. That it's coming up on the 10th anniversary. So that is a story in and of itself about how publishing is changing in terms of representing what is termed in the census as the multiracial experience. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is my Lola Levine series. It's a chapter books series, so it skews a little older than my picture books, of which I have many. This was a passion project in the sense that, as someone who grew up the daughter of a Peruvian immigrant and a South American mother and a North American father, and very much multiracial family and intermarriage, it was and I grew up bilingual and very much centered with in my Latinidad, my identity, both languages, and yet I noticed as a mother, there are very few depictions in children's literature of multiracial, multi-ethnic families, or families with diverse religious backgrounds, etc. And in this series, it's interesting. It was important to me to have depict a multi-ethnic family with different backgrounds, immigrant backgrounds, where the child in the very first book, Lola Levine, is not mean, and Lola is short for Dolores. It's a nickname in Latino culture for Dolores. She says, people sometimes say I'm half this or half that, but I'm whole. My parents told me I'm whole just the way I am. And that was really important to me, because I do think we need to let go of the colonizer's language in describing people in fractions, rather to think about children containing multitudes as a beautiful thing to have multi-ethnic backgrounds, not to feel less than in whatever category. And and this is somewhat autobiographical. It's interesting how people read onto you as a writer, not completely, but she is the daughter of a Peruvian immigrant who's a writer and who's Catholic, and her father is of Eastern European, Jewish origin in the book, but she's also fiercely herself and also explores in the way my two daughters did different aspects of gender. She's a fierce soccer player, and in the very first, she's very aggressive, and she does a slide tackle with her friend Juan in a game, and he gets hurt, and people start calling her mean Lola Levine. And it's a lot about her negotiating her energy, which is very strong and fierce and loud and non-gender conforming in some ways. And it was important to me to have all sorts of representations of what of young girls and boys. There's really interesting conversations through different books with different themes. I have two daughters, and truthfully, one is a ballerina and one is a fierce soccer player. They are both hardcore feminists, and they meet, even though in the fictional world, Bella Benitez, which is one of my family names, is a ballerina, and Lola's a soccer player, and they instantly dislike each other. But then in the wisdom, their parents make them go to each other's activities, and they learn out that things like strength, commitment, and passion, physical grace are important to both soccer and ballet. And this book has a lot of humor. It's light. The family is really interesting, and it's fun, and it's so one thing to share with you about the world of publishing. This is from Little Brown. This book also is a challenge to get published. And at first, when I was talking with my agent about what I really wanted to do, there's a lot of desire for middle grade and edgy YA, and that's beautiful and wonderful and needed. But probably because I had, in some ways, such an edgy childhood, I actually wanted to dwell in a place that was younger for me, for the writing life that I have, and books were an escape for me. And so I decided to write a chapter book series, and some of the initial feedback was well, we want this. These are from Big Five publishers. We want this series, but can you make her not be a soccer player, because soccer books don't sell for girls? And I thought, really? I actually had an editor tell me, an editor of Pinkalicious, that series, tell me that's the one where she plays soccer sold the least. And I thought, well, maybe the readers of my Lola books would be different from the readers of Pinkalicious, not to diss on Pinkalicious. I was told, can she play a musical instrument instead of play soccer? Or can you give her a superpower? And my dear friend who's a writer said, what if her superpower is that she's a fierce, amazing child and has a whole kind of family? And so I had fun writing this. It's very autobiographical. I went back and forth to Peru with my family, and she visits Peru in the fourth book. There's so many themes explored. I mean, I like to say that between this book and my book, Charuco, not many writers have had the opportunity for picture books and chapter books to explore ideas like colonization itself and understanding of that indigenous history of the Americas and Peru. But this character is just one that was very important to me, and it was depicting the kind of family that I had, that I did not see represented in children's literature at all. And that's just a little bit about Lola. She likes Halloween. She likes scaring people to the point where she's kind of like too much, which is how I felt most of my life. Too much, too loud, too assertive, too competitive, too desirous of experience. And so sometimes that hurts and sometimes it's joyful, but she negotiates it among a loving, diverse family. So that's a little bit about this series with humor and aplomb.
Thank you, Monica. So if we can move over to Naomi.
Hi, thank you all. It's such a pleasure to be with you today, and I'm fascinated by hearing everyone else speak. Thank you. I'll pick for my character from The Turtle of Oman, the grandfather figure who goes by Sidi, the Arabic word for grandfather. It's what my son called my father. And in writing this book, I wanted to make a little boy character who's the main character who was worried about change. But because of the demonization of especially Arab men over the past, unfortunately, decades, I felt very committed to making an adorable Arab man that any kid who read the book would wish that were his grandfather or her grandfather. So in creating Sidi, I did focus a lot on qualities of my own father, who had died already at the time I was writing this book, and who never went to Oman, by the way, but it was a country that fascinated him as much as it always fascinated me. So I had aspects of a person I had actually known that I could translate over to the Sidi character in the book. I wanted the grandfather to be very old world, very distinguished, very funny, very kooky, a little bit surprising in his responses to things. And so I fell in love with him myself, and he definitely became another person. He became a character, not just a memory of my father in the book. And in writing the sequel of this book, which is called The Turtle of Michigan, which won't be out till next March, Sidi ended up surprising me. He has done something in that book that I had no idea he would be doing. And so that is the great pleasure of getting to know a character and empowering them somehow through the writing process, where they take on their own decision-making possibilities and do things that that give us all joy. So I was most touched. Writers don't expect awards. We don't dream of awards, maybe. I mean, I don't. But this book received the strangest award I've ever even heard of, which I had never heard of before, which was from the American Geriatric Society or something like that, for creating the most appealing older character for the year this book came out of all American chapter books. And that to me was the best happy little note I could ever have received. And when I have appeared talking about this book, either virtually this past year and a half or in person before this, kids often want to talk about the loving relationship that Sidi has, not only with his own grandson, but with his own place and with Arabic culture as a whole. So I feel that he succeeded as a character in just transmitting a positive affection for the Middle East and people who value the stories and the traditions of the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. So now it's Özge. Oh, you're on mute. Oh.
Okay, so my character is, my book, Dare to Disappoint, was an autobiographical graphic novel. So it was my growing up story in Turkey. So the main character is myself, and that's the one I know best. So I'm going to talk about that one. Though my uncle would be another super interesting character. So building on what Naomi brought us, the change, it's so beautiful what she said. The character is afraid of change. And my character wants to change, wants to become something, but doesn't know what it is. Like the main drive of the character is to do something substantial with her life, but she doesn't know what it is. And she has this like sister who is the perfect sister who achieves everything so well and receives all the approval of the family. That's a role model. And then there's this uncle character who is like a socialist type of person who lives against the society, it's against the like traditional family, which is a very exciting, adventurous role model. But there is a father who is coming from orphanage, and he made a man of himself. So he's an overachiever with high expectations, and you can't ever please him. And this character's main aim is she wants to please the family. She wants to be like her sister. She wants to please the teachers. But meanwhile, like, and then she is living in an economically unstable country that everybody advises you to become a doctor or engineer. And there's religious pressure, and Turkey has a militaristic history. Like, all in the, I mean, all of this, the character tries to find her own voice and tries to figure out what she's going to be, and she makes million mistakes and breaks herself apart like a glass window. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to move because this is something I've already felt in some of your answers, where when you write, you might have a conception of the reader, and how sometimes when the book is out in the world, the reader actually turns out to be a bit more diverse than you think, or maybe in the case of those who are working in graphic novels, you might not necessarily have started writing for young people even. And I'm going to start with you, Özge, because I think also this book started out as something for your friends.
That is true. Yeah. I like, the way I came up with was I wanted to make a birthday present for a close friend. And we shared a lot of anecdotes about our mothers, lived anecdotes. And for her birthday, I filled out a notebook in a week for her. And then she loved the notebook, but then our other friends started photocopying this notebook, and it turned into a zine, and it went out of control. And I would walk into a party, and someone would come, someone I don't know, and would hug me and say, I read your notebook, let me tell you my childhood. So there I thought, wow, like, lived stories have such power, and I should do something about it. And like, ignorantly, I thought I invented the autobiographical comics genre. I was that illiterate about it at that point. This is like 25 years ago or so. So the beginning of the journey is that, and then it matured a lot after that point. I write for my friends here.
And how do you feel when you're writing a graphic novel, which is for a more general audience, but perhaps now it's getting used in schools? Like, how do you think of that sort of space where it could possibly be used?
I didn't have that notion in my hand. I was writing for my friends, and then after the book was sold, that possibility was introduced to me by my editor. It was a very traumatic and painful process, because I mean, I just wanted to tell it to the people in my head, but I had to explain some of the cultural landmarks and issues, and I got into that mind state. I think I am like somewhere in between. I know the large crowd who is not familiar with the Turkish history and past. So, but at the core, I'm still writing for my friends.
Okay. If I can just move over to Edgardo, because I think you're in a similar position where you're writing, comic books which are for everyone, but they're, of course, and this is why, you're on this panel, they can be really important resources for young people. So your initial idea of your audience, what did you think of it? Now that the comic has a life of its own, how are you dealing with this sort of expansion of your audience potentially?
Well, thank you. First, I want to preface by saying that one of the reasons why I actually started making my graphic novels was because I wanted to bring awareness to the political and socioeconomic issues affecting Puerto Rico. And I wanted to do it in a way that would generate a larger conversation than just a meme or a post or an article or an op-ed. And I looked at my own family. So in terms of the idea of who the audience was, I have two sons. At the time, I had a newborn who was just born literally when the idea of La Boriqueña came to me. and a 12-year-old. My comic book is 5 years old now, so I have a 17-year-old and a 5-year-old, right? I wanted to create work that I did not have to hide from my sons. No, 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 don't look at my monitor. No, no, this is grown-up stuff. Keep away from daddy's office. And it's the opposite. I wanted to create work that would invite them into my workspace here at home. And in essence, I wanted to create work that would invite everyone into the conversation, into the pages. I independently published these books, so I've never experienced the idea of dealing with a major publisher, shooting down an idea or telling me that the character should maybe change the color of her cape or the color of her skin or even the concept of selling a story. And I've been independently publishing my series, and I still am. Just before today's presentation, I was literally stuffing envelopes and boxes that my oldest son dropped off at the post office. The journey that this project has taken over the last 5 years is something that I could have never projected, honestly. The Penn Faulkner Foundation in Washington, D.C. Purchases our books and distributes them to public schools throughout the school district. So elementary school students are studying La Borinqueña, and they're learning about Puerto Rican history, and the majority of them are not Latinx students. Universities across the United States are teaching, graduate students are teaching my books. One of the things that I discovered by independently publishing this is that I needed to get my story out quickly. There was a social issue. These issues will continue to affect Puerto Rico. And I published this book literally less than a year before Hurricane Maria came out. And I was already addressing climate change issues in Puerto Rico. So I never expected the book to take the journey that it has. I can never say that there was one particular audience that I had in mind. I will say that I do get reactions when I'm in Puerto Rico and I talk to a predominantly, obviously a Puerto Rican crowd. They're very surprised that people care to read the story about Puerto Rico. And I share with them that when I give talks across the United States, the majority of the people in the room are not Puerto Riqueño. And that the work that I'm trying to do is trying to really tap into our common humanity, the commonalities we have as human beings, and to get beyond this racist terminology of mainstream storytelling, because mainstream storytelling is just synonymous with white patriarchal storytelling. And this publishing industry and this entertainment industry in this world and Western culture across the planet has shaped us into thinking that the main narrative is told through the perspective of a white man, and that anything else is not. So you'll have your Asian Pacific American shelves in the bookstore, or your Latinx shelves, or your African American shelves, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the mainstream, there's the American classic. And what I strive to do is tell a story that will tap into the universality of our humanity. We're all affected by climate change. We're all affected by loss in our family. We all have family, and I think we all want heroes, and I think it's important that a character can be created that a little white girl with blue hair can look at it and say, that's me. Just as anyone else can see a brunette with blue eyes from another planet and say, oh, that's me, So I'm saying that it's important to create a story from a place that will resonate with many people. And it's amazing to see how academicians and even students have taught me about my own work. And I'm now looking at my work and can say that it's an intersectional graphic novel, because this is what students and professors have shown me about my own work. And it's fascinating. It reminds me of when I was in high school, I was studying a poem by Robert Frost. And I read an article about it where they interviewed the poet, right? And they were asking him about one of his very famous pieces, right? How do you feel? It's being taught, da, 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 da. And they're saying this about the poem. He's like, it's just about walking through the forest. That's all I wrote. What are people talking about? And that's what's beautiful about it. It's like, people take so much, and that's great. And I think that's powerful, that people should take so much more out of it. But I think the responsibility of the artist and the storyteller is just to tell the story. And it's the responsibility of the student and the educator to make that story universal, to make that story resonate with their students. So if you want to, if you're a teacher and you want to teach about climate change, then you bring my book into the classroom. If you want to teach about a family that has a diverse lifestyle and not a diverse life because of religion and race, then you bring in Monica's stories. You see, if you want to tell a story that has intergenerational appeal, then you bring in Naomi. So you see what I'm saying? So that I think that's what the goal of even today's roundtable is about. Is that we're telling you, like, see the universality in our stories. You know, don't just and see that these are the new classics that will be teaching and need to be taught in classrooms across the United States.
Thank you, Edgardo. So the question to you, Monica, now.
Yes, I'm just so caught up in what Edgardo was saying. And so I write, I feel like we have immense responsibility writing for children, and I do write for young children. So I know that we have a diversity of authorial perspectives and experience on this amazing panel. But I feel like if they're letting us into their minds, I have a responsibility, and I want my books to inspire or entertain or provide comfort. Like if you know, I think of the younger child that I was, and books were an escape from loneliness, a comfort. During some really challenging adolescent years, they were like a refuge, truly. They also helped me imagine my life. So with my biographical books, I want children to be able to imagine their lives. I wrote a book. I'm a football fanatic. I love soccer. My whole family, nothing needs to be said since I'm from South America about that. However, I did write about Pele and the fact that he was teased for being, they called his team the barefoot team, and they would play with toronjas, with grapefruits, or they would steal socks and stuff them with newspapers. And when he was recruited to a professional team, he basically ate for a year. He was so skinny and tiny because he was undernourished that they thought he was the ball boy, right? And so when I read that story to young students, I say, so what do you need to become the absolute best in the world like he did? Do you need a fancy uniform? Do you need the best shoes with brands, etc.? Or I tell the story of Dolores and Huerta and Cesar Chavez. So in terms of who I write for, I started writing for my own daughters when they were picture book age because I didn't see the stories. I love the famous Toni Morrison quote, if you are seeking a story that does, and I'm paraphrasing, that doesn't exist, then you might have to write it yourself. So I did that, but I didn't only write for my children. I really do write for all children. And in terms of classroom use, I'm a teacher and have been before I was a writer, and I hope that all writers, I believe books do work in the world. So maybe what they do is teach, not in a didactic way, because there's nothing that's a bigger turn off to children, just like this is the lesson and then story follows. I think that it has to be more organic. But I do, as a teacher, believe in justice-oriented education, and I do as a former activist. I can't call myself that now in my staid existence, though I still march on occasion. But I think books do beautiful work in the world. If we think of our young children, our students of children of immigrants, our students of color, most of them are taught by people that are members of the dominant culture, the majority culture in the United States. So books really can be a bridge in a creative way. I'm really involved with the Literacy Center and have been off and on over the years in my town. And they use some of my picture books, I found out, to teach English, because you can learn in context with bilingual books. You have two beautiful languages side by side on the page. I always am very involved in the curriculum development process. I've trained teachers to incorporate creative literature like Edgardo's and Naomi's into the curriculum, because it's, you know, why there's an immense way that children can learn by through fiction and through story, walking in the shoes, even if it's briefly, of others, including empathy and compassion, as well as, you know, the recognition that some of our students, our Latinx students, for example, don't have about the contributions of Latinx peoples to the Americas, about writers and people who imagined their lives. So that's sort of a meandering answer to your question. I don't know if you have a follow-up, but I think books are important. I actually think teachers, and this is a room full of teachers, are the real publishers, because you disseminate books, you put books in the hands of children. So I would just hope that this kind of event helps you realize that you're making those choices about how they might experience worlds greater than their own, or find their own faces and stories and families in the literature of the classroom, which is where they spend the most of their time.
Thank you, Monica. I will come back a bit to some of the work you've done with teachers, but now I'll move over to Naomi just to ask you that same question. And you're someone who writes, I believe, you have books for adults, you have books for young people. And what is your conception of the audience, and what happens when the books come out into the world with that audience?
Thank you all for your beautiful comments. And Monica, you use the words comfort and inspiration, and Edgardo talking about humanity and trying to expand our sense of humanity. I always feel that I'm writing for people in a moment of anxiety, maybe experiencing expansion and change and fearing it, because I think of change as being a big major element of all of our lives, no matter what age we are. And so in The Turtle of Oman, Arif, the main character, is very anxious about moving to the United States. In two of my previous books, Habibi, the girl, is moving from the United States to Jerusalem. In City Secrets, the girl is simply traveling to Jerusalem to see her grandmother, and then her world and her dreams are ever more expanded. And she's now anxious, however, about, say, military actions made by the United States that might affect people in the Middle East, who are very humble people who don't have power over their governments. But when I write about change, I'm trying to figure out some way that the child who is experiencing fear, phobia, anxiety about doing something different, or being somewhere else, being someone else as we grow, how they can face up to that, what will help them. So what are their tactics? What are their strategies? The boy Arif is a list maker. He loves copying lists of new things he discovers, which he carries on when he gets to the United States. That gives him sort of a sense of focus, the swirl of new information around him. But if he keeps a list of details which interest him, intrigue him, which I think is helpful for everybody of any age, then you might have something to go by. So that becomes sort of his personal way of staying whole. I wasn't just thinking of kids moving from country to country, though, in terms of change, especially after my first school visits with the Turtle of Oman, when many kids told me they had extreme anxiety about changing grades within their schools and going to a new classroom, having a new teacher, whole new ways of doing things, new friends, new expectations. And it's startled me, because I'd kind of forgotten how traumatic that is when you're leaving a classroom you've come to love. So I started realizing you could be a person staying in the same house, the same neighborhood all your life, and still fretting about change just as much as a boy moving across the ocean does. So many times I feel my characters have to learn these things through metaphor. And in The Turtle of Oman, for example, it's the animals which are helping him, the birds, the butterflies, the turtles, who also have to migrate, have to go away, come back. what is that like for them? And I just want to read a couple of sentences here I pulled out of my notebook. I've never read this to anyone, just a few lines about what I think is important and why I value the perspectives of kids so much. And this happened during this past year and I haven't shared it, just a personal experience. On Saturday, I had the incredible pleasure of working with kids in the West Bank, mixed ages, but I'd guess they were mostly 9 or 10. Truly their writing powers, even while writing in their second language, English, were profoundly inspiring to me. They were writing stories more than poems and had a million questions. One adorable boy is working on a graphic novel called Bug Wars. Now, this was intriguing to me because he's living in the occupied West Bank, and I know the town he's living in. His family has probably suffered a lot during the occupation over his entire lifetime. He told me spiders often impersonate ants because they are afraid of ants. I asked, how does a spider impersonate an ant? He leaned forward to his screen and said, it's mostly the facial expression. Now, I just thought that was brilliant. A child thinking about a spider's facial expression during lockdown, when he's probably been living in lockdown most of his life anyway. It just blew my mind that kids are capable of much more metaphorical magic than we might be capable of writing for them. I hope he finishes his book. I urged him forward to try to publish it somehow. And, you know, we all face change from the moment we're born. The 1-year-old turning to the 2-year-old faces change. So, you know, I feel that those are the characters and the needs I'm writing for. How do we find our continual comfort in the face of all the change of a lifetime?
Yes, that's good.
I just wanna, Naomi's words brought me something. That wonderful Linda Berry has a way of thinking which may be helpful to teachers in this group, and exactly builds on what Naomi is bringing up. So Linda Berry pairs up a child with a college student, and the child tells the story and the college student makes the comics drawings for the child's story. So such pairing is, I mean, obviously they are better artists than us, so why not to use their talent?
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to come back a bit to the question of representation. So all of you talk about people from different cultures, some American, some not American, some who immigrated, some who were born in the United States. And I know the question that's usually asked, what are you hoping that people can get from your book? But I'm going to ask you another question, which is, what are you sometimes afraid that people might get from the representations, not in terms of the way you've written them, but to what extent when you're writing, you are somehow thinking of how the books will be received by dominant groups, especially as you're writing about communities like Naomi mentioned, that are just so many negative stereotypes around them. So how do you deal with that burden of responsibility, and what can teachers do to sort of take some of that burden off of you? So let's see, I will start with you, Monica, if that's okay.
So for me, I have to write without fear or it does not go well. That doesn't mean I don't have fear, but fear and creativity are antithetical, I think, because it takes a great deal of, you have to find self-belief. And I have 30 published books for children, but every one of them had rejections, even though they found a home. So rejection is something that when I teach writing, like you got to embrace it, like let it make you stronger. That doesn't mean once it's done or it's going out there, I don't have anxieties. It's interesting because I will address what the rhetoric is. Like what I've noticed at one time, it used to be the concept of being not PC that people are afraid of. And now they use this dismissive term of woke culture. as though like, oh, nothing can be done, or, oh, there's a shorthand almost like blaming people of color for any inconvenience to oneself from what I see. And so what I think that I try to do is I do work. Like, so if I'm writing about an experience, if I'm not writing about a fictional character created from my brain, and I'm writing about a non-fictional character that may not be, you know, Peruvian American or mixed, or I do extra work, and I'm ready if someone wants to critique me, that I will accept that critique. And I try to stand, I believe in my work, so that if I need to receive critique, I listen, I learn, or I listen and decide that I still feel comfortable with my representation. You know, in a case, interestingly, my book Charuco, which just came out, even though my grandmother was mostly indigenous Peruvian and mixed with Spanish and Black African, I am not an indigenous Peruvian. I have some heritage. So in a book like this, and the illustrator, Elisa Chavari, is Peruvian. She was born in Peru and is a Peruvian immigrant. My mother actually, for part of her teen years, lived on Julio Citello Boulevard in Lima. That's how I was introduced to this amazing man. But for this book, since it was a story about an indigenous Peruvian, and I felt so deeply and passionately about wanting to do something that has been shared in Peru and through the department he once taught at. And it was so important to me that for this book, and I don't usually use what in the field is called sensitivity readers, because I do a lot of research. I was a journalist, and it takes more work. That's what I think sometimes people are dismissive of, the work it takes to get rid of the fear and the self-questioning. So I shared this with another indigenous Peruvian archaeologist and another archaeologist to make sure that I understood a deeper knowledge of the history of what he represented as the first indigenous Quechua-speaking archaeologist and conservationist of the Americas, and his advocacy for indigenous rights. So I suppose I had a little unease for like a minute, but the solution to fear is craft and research and doing the work, so that if it's not received, and our books are received a million different ways, and I will be honest and say most of mine have been incredibly positively received. I wrote a book that I was nervous about, my first published book that class helped support with an Americas Award, Rafael Lopez's first published book. And we talked and collaborated on how we were going to represent the Cuban Revolution. Here's what we came up with. I don't have guns in my books for children. I don't have battles. And yet revolution is painful regardless. There's people hurt, etc. And so I really wanted to represent it in a way that if you were living in Cuba, if you were outside of Cuba, whatever you brought, since I'm not Cuban American, you would not be harmed by this book. And so Rafael and I, together with the art director, decided to represent it with fire. That is honest. And she does, when Celia leaves, she leaves her heart behind. But I realized that as a non-Cuban American depicting that, and the greatest compliment was when a Cuban immigrant told me I was anxious to get to that part. And when I saw it, I let out a sigh of relief. So whenever there's an issue that I think is going to be sensitive, I never want my work to do harm in the world. I really think about it. And we thought about that in the depiction of colonization, because that was he called it, Julio Citello, whose nickname was Charuco. And this is a Quechua word in a mainstream, to play on the word Edgardo talked about, publisher. That was his nickname. It meant brave. We talked a lot about how we wanted to depict that. I worked with the illustrator, Elisa, in a way that was honest, but again, not like re-traumatizing for the very young children that read picture books. So I don't know if I've touched on your question, but there's my start.
Thank you, Monica.
everyone has to say, everyone else.
So if I can bring the question over to you, Özge, and you were mentioning how you provide, well, that's very clear in the book, where you provide so much background information and you do a lot of effort to make your characters, like the father is not this villain. He's actually quite a complex character. He's quite sympathetic. You put her, her own indecision and the fact that certain jobs are preferred, but you link that to economic insecurity. So it's not just oppressive Middle Eastern culture forcing children to do things in a particular way. So if I can just move this question over to you about when you were preparing the book, you probably had in mind what your audience, and you referred to this earlier, what your audience knows about your context, and how did you sort of deal with that and manage that to hopefully create a book that you're quite happy with?
So that's such a great question. It was the most challenging part of creating that book, because as a writer, I wanted to just tell the anecdotes that I wanted to tell, but there was the editor constantly reminding me that the reader doesn't know about Atatürk, the founder of Turkish Republic. They don't know what's a last name revolution. They don't know the very complicated education system of Turkey, and those are very legitimate points. And what happened was I drew everything as thumbnails, and that draft of the book was I have to rewrite that 6 times. It was really there was a point I threw the pen. I said, I'm not doing this. It's over. I really considered canceling the contract, and super difficult because I had to explain those cultural references without making the story didactic. And I mean, on the second draft, I tried to insert everything editor asked me to do, and it read awfully. It was a very boring book. And then I had to process. And now at this point, I'm doing my second book. There is no editor speaking on top of me. And I internalize that voice that I already do it myself. And I actually enjoy those parts. I create these infographic pages that I can introduce the culture, but I put my cynical voice on top of it. So it works out at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for everybody who's read the book, like you said, the cynical distancing, and it's just a very funny book. And that's not also something that people associate with, the Middle East, unfortunately, but, you showed that it can be done. I'm going to change the question for the last two because we're coming up to the Q&A with the teachers. So this is a question for Edgardo and Naomi. Both of you, to different extents, you use either Spanish or Arabic in your books, to very different extents. I would say in the Borinqueña, English and Spanish have, roughly the same status. Naomi, you pepper quite a lot of Arabic words. You also refer to elements of Arabic culture that sometimes, I think for the most part, to explain to the reader who might not be familiar. So I just want to, starting with Naomi and then moving to Edgardo, what led you to take those particular decisions concerning language use? And how would you like teachers in the classroom to help, when they see these words that students might not understand, how can they sort of guide the students somehow? And if there's an invitation in your use of other languages, how can the teachers help the students take up these invitations? So I'll start with you, Naomi, and then we'll move over to Edgardo.
Okay, I think Edgardo probably will have a better answer. Well, I'm a person filled with shame about my monolingual status. Even though I studied Spanish, I studied Arabic, and I studied German, I don't speak any of them fluently. And I feel terrible about that. And I often ask, groups of kids, how many of you speak 2 languages fluently? You're so smart. You're so lucky. I'm so proud of you, because I couldn't do it. I think my second language site in my brain was not very strong somehow. But I love hearing the other languages and I loved studying them. So I try to use Arabic words in a way that will not be too overwhelming for non-Arabic speakers, since I myself am not an Arabic speaker. I can understand a lot of Arabic. If you're having a conversation with someone else, I might be able to know what's going on, but I wouldn't feel comfortable giving a talk in Arabic or anything like that. So I try to put words, food words, common phrases into the context where a teacher who has never encountered them before would be able to sound them out or derive their meaning. And I love the sounds of the words. I love Spanish words when I read books that include a lot of Spanish words, even though I probably will understand them from having studied it the longest. I just like to hear them in my mind. So I think it creates a rich texture of the way the world really is, because we hear all these languages mixed together. I live on a street in San Antonio, Texas, where most people speak Spanish or Italian on the street. And so you hear other languages when you're just walking down the street. And I want the books to feel that way and feel comfortable that way. And I do think we're always trying to embody humanity. And so much of humanity does bear more than one language in the psyche now. And also just in the context of neighborhood and hearing it, that I don't think it's that off-putting, hopefully, for teachers who have never spoken an Arabic word in their lives, say to be reading a chapter of the Turtle of Oman out loud and come to one or two words they have to sound out. And there may well be someone in the class who uses that word and they may help out. So hopefully it's creating just a genuine texture of what language and text in the world is like for us these days. And I want to thank Özge also for mentioning Linda Berry, whom I admire so much. I just love her ways of working with people as well as her own books. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. So moving over to you, Edgardo.
Thank you, Naomi, for that, because I think you said something that I believe in too, because language is around us and we hear it and we live around it. And to actually create literature that is monolingual is actually as disingenuous a way of telling a story as can any other thing that can be perceived as bigoted, sexist, etc. Um, you know, we grow up reading mainstream books that introduce us to Elvish, that introduce us to all of these fantastical languages. But because of systemic racism, other languages other than, quite honestly, European based, with the exception of Spanish, tend to be kind of like elevated, right? Um, And if you're Spanish speaking or Arabic speaking or any native languages of the African continent speaking, it's seen as less than, because it challenges, not challenges, it goes against the whole white supremacist model, which is upholding Eurocentric standards. I always joke saying it's kind of messed up that Spaniards get lumped into the whole thing too, because Spaniards are European, but you know what? You colonized us, so you're in the same group with us. I write my books bilingually because life is multilingual. And then on the funny side, with the technology that we have nowadays, I mean, come on, man, just scan your phone over something, and you can literally like find out what is being written. I actually learned that from a 5-year-old girl in our neighborhood who told me, "I love la Kenya." I was like, "Really? How did you do with the Spanish?" I used my dad's iPhone and I just scanned the Spanish and it just translated it for me. I was like, "Oh shoot, I didn't know you could do that." So you can do that. And we don't walk around our barrios here in the United States and with like subtitles floating around us. You know what I mean? We just deal with it. And no, not everyone is talking about you. You know what I mean, when they're speaking another language. So I think it's empowering to show multilingual stories. I think it's empowering, and it's also challenging this um, belief that growing up in the United States, we should just be a monolingual nation. I mean, there is no official language in the United States, even though in Puerto Rico it's imposed that there are 2 official languages. In the United States, there's no official language. You can, depending on where you are in the United States, you can see signage in Arabic or in Mandarin or in Spanish or in French or in Portuguese, because there's no official. So why should literature be officiated to a standard language? you know.
Thank you, Edgardo. I think, James, I think we can field some questions from the teachers. If any of them want to.
Definitely. I let folks know in the chat if you've got any questions to pop them into the chat, or you can raise your hand as Katharina has, and I'm going to ask her to unmute and ask her question. Oh.
Thank you. This has been a really interesting conversation. My question is about process. As you are writing as adults, how do you get into the mindset of your younger protagonists? How do you embody what it is like to be a child or a young person?
Do you want to ask that question of all the panelists, right? Or anyone in particular?
Whoever would like to respond.
Okay, good.
I'll respond quickly. I have two sons, so I'm like bouncing between two generations of vernacular. I call my sons the bookends because one is 5 and one is 17. When I'm writing La Borinqueña, I listen to a lot of reggaeton, Bad Bunny, and I also listen to Radio Pública, which is NPR public radio in Puerto Rico. And my editor is about 20 years younger than me. So I try to keep my my vernacular, my idioms very contemporary to a younger voice. My character is a college student, young, in late teens. You know, she's like 18, 19. So I want to keep my vernacular very up to date and also very contemporary for young boys. So listening to music, listening to young people, my own sons, and having younger people working with me helps as well.
Thank you.
Oh, no, you first, Naomi.
I like to draw on memory. I have a really vivid memory of what it was like to be a kid. And also I've spent my entire life working with kids because they're my favorite people. So it's never hard to enter into that world. I just think about them all the time. To me, they're the center of the universe, the biggest idealists we have. And they don't disappoint, using the word in Özge's title, as much as adults do. So I just like to think about their minds and their perspectives.
Monica?
And I agree. I do love children very much. You know how some people are dog lovers and and others have dogs but only love their own dogs. I have a well of love for children and care and concern, and so I love writing for them. I will say that the difference for like my scholarly work when I write for children, and this is a tip because I bet we have aspiring writers for youth here, I write in the morning because it is easier for me to enter that world that is, you can write about, and I have, difficult things for children, but not without hope. So I find that the night me, where the day's stresses and anxieties about the world have accumulated, is not a good space for writing for children. I can edit, I could look at art, etc., but I write in the morning when my mind is at its most calm, and that gives me the place to write for children. To tie it all back to Linda Berry, I will say she has an amazing book called Syllabus. And I recommend, even if you read the first 10 pages, and she recommends that the first thing adults do is that they get a crayon and draw stick figures and have creativity. So when I've been stumped, I sometimes do art too, because even though I wouldn't dare illustrate my own books, I work with much more talented artists. It puts me in the frame of mind of illustratable action and things like that. And when I was really ill, if I have a YouTube channel with a few things, author Monica Brown. I did a little video, like a little film, tiny project with stick figures about what I was going through. And it was so therapeutic. So I think how children create more freely and not worrying about one-to-one representation is something that all of us as teachers can tap into as creators, as creative people.
I like that. That's really beautiful.
Could jump in with a question now. Yeah, I wasn't sure if anyone else wanted to add anything. So we do have a question in the chat.
Yes. Do you want me
And
to
this
read it
comes
out?
from Jean Connolly, who says, "Thank you so much. I teach language arts to middle school students. My students have great ideas, but struggle to get them down on paper. What advice do you have for students who are developing writers?"
I think I can jump in for that. I see writing and drawing as the same activity, and I think this would apply anything. So one thing is like keep doing it, even if it's not, even if it's hard, even if it's not the right day, even if you're not enjoying it that moment, but just like you need to be persistent in doing that. It will get better. That's one thing. The second thing is just that editor who speaks, the inner editor, like turn the volume down on that and let keep doing, let the fun to find you, and then doing the adjustments is an easy thing later on. So like one thing is when they try to do the most perfect thing, then they paralyze themselves and they stop doing it. So the biggest and main challenge is like, how do you turn into a habit, and without caring it's good or bad, you keep doing it. And I'm sure others will add other strategies on that.
May I say something?
Yes,
I
please.
100% agree with what you said. That's so important. And sometimes to get rid of that censor, that editor, sometimes to encourage middle school age students to imagine they're writing for someone young. Strategies I like to think about with them is writing questions, writing in questions, writing in conversation, because middle school students are very adept at creating a conversation, or writing in the letter format, you know, speaking to something directly, intimately. And that can help them feel that they're not speaking about things, which often feels overwhelming at that middle school age, but just make it more direct who they're appealing to. And that will kind of demystify the worry they have.
Monica and Edgardo, if you have something to add.
I mean, I think writing can always be available to a student and not just around an assignment. When I was younger, every week in elementary school, I recall maybe third grade, we had 10 new words, 10 new vocabulary words. And our assignment was to, you know, by the end of the week, we needed to know what these words meant. So write a sentence. I used to take those 10 words and write a story with them. That wasn't the assignment. The assignment was to just like, you know, write a sentence. Like, I understand what this word means, you know. And I not only took that as an opportunity to write, but I created an episodic story. And I created two characters, and every week, if there was a new chapter in the story, and that wasn't an assignment. That was just something that I just saw. There was an opportunity to write. So I think the challenge or the introduction of writing, it shouldn't be centered around assignment. It should be centered around an activity. It should be centered around fun. It should be centered around ritual, you know.
Yeah, I think I like that. And it's hard to think about how to approach this question because I write for children, but I teach writing to teenagers and older people. But I do know when I talk about what writing is to children, I ask, like, what can you do with you as a writer? And people think of assignments, etc. But I remind them, like, what about songs? You can write lyrics. You can, if you write comic books, you write op-eds and opinions, you write a letter to your best friend. You know, when I teach college students, and I've taught high school students to write about voice, I've taught Gloria Anzaldua's How to Tame a Wild Tongue, because she talks, and this goes back to language, she talks about being multiply literate in all the different ways they're literate. So I set like all the languages they speak, like if it's Spanglish or if it's Like I teach in Arizona, I have people talk about speaking the language of horse, like animals, speaking the language of being a fast food worker, etc. And so affirming the different types of writing they do, or have them write about an event in their life to their best friend, and then have them sit down and write it again, but to their grandmother, and think about, like, if I'm trying to teach them about audience and voice, how they can do that. This is where I do like, one fun way is to integrate the arts, which is why comics are such a perfect place in the classroom. If they're I have a lot of biographies, so if they pick a person from their family or not and share some facts, they can then maybe illustrate certain episodes and then go back and write more, etc. So I think there's infinite ways to approach it, but the idea is to allow students to know what words can do, the power of words and art in the world and their own self-expression. I mean, that's what I got from reading people that influenced me, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Sandra Cisneros talked about this. She said she thought you go live on an island, or you're an adventurer, there's different models for writing, but getting young people excited about it is a start.
Thank you so much, Monica. I think
That's a nice sentiment.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Edwin, you have a question. You should be able to unmute.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, everybody. This question is for Professor Abou Ghaida. I've listened to the audio. I wasn't able to watch the video, but I listened to the audio, and so I apologize if you made reference to it in the video, which I missed. But I was intrigued that the idea of the gatekeeping that you had mentioned about what content makes it into publication, and how youth and adolescents are represented. And you had made cursory mention of one particular topic that really intrigued me, and I'm going to ask you if you could expand on it a little bit now. And that's I forgot exactly how you put it, where certain language or content is included deliberately to inspire enmity, or to positively reinforce I don't even know how to put it, the perspectives of, I think you put it perhaps maybe to steer students to particular ideologies that that are associated with incitement. You had mentioned a book or two. If you could remind me what that is, I'd like to look it up. And if it's in a language that is not in English, then I'm going to ask you to describe what that looks like or sounds like.
I think I need to be reminded myself of which part that came from. But just to sort of talk about, and this is something just to bring it to the classroom, where in addition to talking about books, I think educators can play a very important role of reminding the students that these books, they don't come out of nowhere. They don't emerge from a vacuum. They are products that are produced through a publishing system. And like some of the authors, like Monica was talking about how certain books were difficult to get published or had to go through a rather rigorous editing system. And I think it's really important to have students try to look at the patterns of what gets published, what doesn't get published, what certain things that could have easily been published with maybe racist content many years ago, but now they're not published anymore. Or I think there's a positive thing to look at publishing as a culture industry, and to maybe help students realize, like, especially books that come from other cultures, are we seeing certain patterns? And that pattern doesn't have to do with what things are like in that particular context, but has to do with what publishers want to, okay, sorry, but just to finish the idea that it's good to get this critical awareness of the industry as an industry, that certain things are popular, certain things are less popular, so that they can have sort of critical stance towards those books. In terms of what Edwin was referring to specifically, which was, I was talking about Arabic books. I think I have a small example now of, especially, this is before the 2000s, you had a lot of Arabic books that were quite ideological because, yeah, so some of them had there's one book, I think that's the example I gave. It's about Palestine. It's called The Home, Al-Bayt. And it talks about, this animal has a house. That's the name of this animal's house is this. And then towards the end, he says the Palestinian doesn't have a house. The Palestinian doesn't have the house because within his house, you will find the enemy of the Palestinian. And how do you get rid of the enemy of the Palestinian? You have to go do military resistance. And this is and that's quite a controversial decision. And sometimes the writers have, like one of the illustrator in particular, he looked back, he was like, what were we thinking? Why weren't we treating them as kids? And I'm not saying that there was something wrong in the book to begin with, because I think we can talk about violence in children's books if it's part of their realities. Like if we don't want violence in children's books, let's create a world where children don't encounter violence or occupation in their lives. But, and I think that book can be quite an interesting discussion point. Should we treat children as political agents, or should we separate politics from the child completely? And that's why that book creates a lot of controversy. And I think it can be an interesting conversation piece to see, and it goes back to our ideas of children as being innocent, and to sort of question that, but also have different opinions about it. I don't think there's a right answer to that question. So thank you, Edwin, for that. And if you want to know more, I mean, the organizers can share my email if you'd like to, ask more questions about that.
Oh, okay, unless someone else is on cue, can I sneak in one more question?
Are we okay?
Go ahead.
Okay, this one is for Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez. I was curious about, as you were describing your characters and your hero, it was really reminiscent of another session years ago in this very forum right here, where we were all given books of this this Haitian hero called Jatao, who strikes me as being so similar to what you're describing, as someone who is seeking to give a voice to those and to correct injustice and to speak up for various different topics of justice and fight evil. And what struck me about, I didn't read very much of it, I also read just the English version, but is so perfect. And I'm wondering, do your characters have human flaws? Meaning not just your characters, but your hero. How do you incorporate that in there? It's muted.
You're on mute, Edgardo.
Totally. The second, I just completed like my first major arc. So since I independently published my own graphic novels, it's episodic storytelling, right? With the third book, it's after 5 years, it's kind of like this final arc had been kind of like not completely wrapped up, but kind of like beginning to kind of show a larger issue. By the second book, Marisol is kind of having, it's stemming in a conflict, because it's not an external conflict, it's an internal conflict. She doesn't know if she is Marisol Rios de la Luz or if she is La Borinqueña. And it's this, and it was originally a narrative that I was working on that was going to create a larger debate around Puerto Ricanos born in Puerto Rico versus those of us born in the diaspora. And it's kind of like, animosity, unfortunately, that tends to develop there. And I felt that was so petty that I felt that the larger issue was seeing this character herself deal with what her own identity is. And that, in an essence, is kind of metaphoric. Obviously, this is a young woman who has superhuman powers, but then it translates into our real lives. If I'm a uh, a professor, and my performance is one way when I'm in this classroom, and I have this kind of shared level of respect amongst my peers and my students. But when I come home, I have a completely dysfunctional, disastrous reality. You know, um, you kind of have this existential crisis, like, what am I? Who am I really? Am I Professor Miranda-Rodriguez, or am I just Edgardo, the guy who can't even like remember to like organize his like recyclables or pick up his son from school, et cetera, right? So yeah, the characters are written very flawed in that way, because I think it challenges the what introduces the whole narrative of, like, you know, when young people see superheroes, they think that there's this, oh, okay, you have superpowers, that's gonna solve everything. And what I try to do in our stars is like, no, actually, if anything, it can create more problems, it can create more conflict. And I want these stories to kind of like resonate beyond the genre of superheroes for young people, so that they can say, I am like Marisol, you know, because I feel like I'm one way when I'm a student in class, but then the reality of my life at home are two different things. Or I'm dealing with my identity. Do I come out, or do I kind of like continue to live this lie that I'm this, you know, heteronormal person when I'm actually not, you know? And it's so it's it I that's kind of like where I try to bring in the conversation of flawness. And there's a physical issue that she deals with, and she's actually asthmatic. You know, she has an asthma pump, and that was intentionally written into the story because young people of color throughout the United States deal with a lot of environmental racism, and as a result of this environmental racism, a side effect of that is extraordinary numbers of cases of young people with asthma. The South Bronx here in New York City has one of the highest rates of asthma in the United States, but it also has one of the highest density communities of Latinx heritage. Puerto Rico also has one of the highest rates of asthma, but it also, for goodness, for almost 40 years, had a thriving pharmaceutical industry that was actually pumping toxins into the waters and into the land and into the air. So there are those flaws, and I think that's very important, because that taps into what I said earlier, trying to create a narrative that really centers around our commonalities as humans, you know, that transcends these fantastical narratives and abilities, but actually at our core, we can relate to, you know.
Peter, do we have any more time, or are we coming up to the hour?
Yeah, I think we're right about good on time. We could, right? I'm checking the chat. Any last questions? I think we're good, right? I think it's been a great session. I think everybody's worked very, very well off of each other, and all these great reading recommendations. Fantastic. So I want to thank you all very much. And Susanne, a really wonderful moderator with fantastic questions. And thank you to all of our panelists for attending. And thank you for all that you do, all that you've written.
Thanks for having us. Thank you so much for having us. And I hope that you all, in today's event, consider our books, introducing them. And I look forward, as well as everyone else, to seeing what adventures and what stories this will inspire your students to create.